Ben Rivers wasn't looking for trouble when he moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood Estates. After years of hospital visits and endless doctor appointments, he just wanted a place to call home, a place where he could finally breathe, relax, and focus on healing. The neighborhood was everything he'd hoped for. Tree-lined streets, freshly mowed lawns, and neighbors who waved hello on morning walks. For Ben, home was more than just a roof and four walls. It was a sanctuary. A refuge from the chaos his chronic illness had brought into his life. His condition demanded constant care and, most importantly, a specific medication that had become the cornerstone of his survival. Without it, his health would spiral out of control. Each morning, Ben carefully stored his medication in a small, insulated cooler on his front porch. It was a practical solution to keep the medicine at the right temperature. And he trusted the neighbors to respect his privacy. He never imagined that such a simple, necessary act would one day become the spark for a fierce battle. Across the street lived Karen Walbridge, a woman with a reputation that preceded her. As one of the HOA board members, Karen was known for her strict enforcement of community rules. She had an uncanny ability to turn even the smallest infraction into a neighborhood ordeal. Some whispered that she enjoyed wielding her power like a weapon, keeping everyone in line with an iron fist wrapped in a smile. From the moment Ben arrived, Karen had taken notice. Maybe it was because he didn't attend every HOA meeting, or maybe it was just the cooler on his porch, a minor deviation from the neighborhood's pristine aesthetic. Whatever the reason, Karen's gaze seemed to linger a little too long, and her tone in emails was a little sharper than necessary. One afternoon, as Ben was sipping his coffee, a bright yellow envelope slid under his front door. He picked it up and read the message carefully. A formal complaint from the HOA about unsightly personal belongings left on the porch. The letter specifically mentioned the cooler and warned that if it wasn't removed, fines would follow. Ben's heart sank. The medication inside that cooler wasn't just any item, it was a lifeline. He immediately reached out to the HOA board, hoping to explain. He wrote a heartfelt email, outlining his medical needs and pleading for an exception. But the reply he received was curt and non-negotiable. "The rules are clear," Karen wrote, signing off as HOA president. "No personal items may be left in common view. This policy applies to everyone equally." Ben stared at the screen, feeling the weight of her words. Equal enforcement sounded fair on paper, but this was about survival. He tried to find allies among his neighbors, but many avoided involvement. Wary of crossing Karen. Days passed, and the tension grew. Ben felt trapped in his own home, the cooler now a symbol of the unyielding bureaucracy suffocating his peace. He started leaving the cooler inside the house during the day, but it wasn't the same. The medication needed to stay cold, and his windows didn't open to a safe spot. The community meetings became battlegrounds, with Karen's voice booming through the room, outlining the importance of rules and community standards. Ben stood in the back, clutching his cane, feeling smaller with every word. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded politely. Others exchanged concerned glances. One neighbor whispered to another, "It's just a cooler. Can't she make an exception?" But Karen was resolute. "If we start making exceptions, where does it end? We must uphold the standards for the good of all." Ben's health was fragile, and the constant stress was taking a toll. He found himself waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, wondering what would happen if his medication was taken away. The thought was unbearable. That night, as the neighborhood lights dimmed, Ben sat alone on his porch, staring at the empty spot where the cooler used to be. The air was heavy with uncertainty, and he knew this was just the beginning of a fight he never wanted but now couldn't avoid. Somewhere across the street, behind closed blinds, Karen watched quietly, her expression unreadable. The battle lines were drawn, and a storm was gathering over Maplewood Estates, one that would change lives forever. The morning sun poured through the window. But Ben Rivers barely noticed. His mind was restless, racing with the weight of the letter still fresh in his hands. The yellow envelope had brought more than just a complaint. It carried a threat. The HOA's letter had been clear. Remove the cooler or face fines. And with Karen Walbridge spearheading the board, Ben knew that fines wasn't an empty warning. He tried calling the HOA office, hoping to speak directly with someone who might understand his situation. The receptionist was polite but firm, directing him to submit another formal request for an exception. Ben sighed, pulling out his laptop to draft a message he'd sent before, one that begged for mercy. This time, he added more detail. explaining how the medication was life-saving and how the cooler was the only safe way to store it outside his window, which couldn't hold the medication properly due to heat exposure. He hit send, hoping for a compassionate response. But the reply came faster than he expected. Karen had responded herself, her tone cold and unwavering. "We appreciate your concerns, Mr. Rivers," she wrote. "However, the community rules must be followed. No exceptions will be made." Ben's heart sank deeper. It wasn't just a letter anymore. It was a decree. Word started to spread in the neighborhood. A few neighbors approached Ben cautiously, offering sympathies in hushed tones, but making it clear they didn't want to get involved. The fear of Karen's influence was strong, and many had learned that crossing her came with consequences. That afternoon, Ben decided to visit his pharmacist in person. Maybe the pharmacist could help. After all, the pharmacist knew the importance of his medication and might be able to offer advice on storage or even speak up on his behalf. At the pharmacy, the pharmacist greeted Ben with a warm smile. He listened carefully as Ben explained the situation, the HOA rules, Karen's letters, and the looming threat of losing his medication. "That's serious," the pharmacist said, frowning. "Medication like yours isn't just any prescription. It requires careful handling, and you can't afford to be without it." Ben nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. "Is there anything you can do? Maybe a note or something that explains my situation to the HOA?" The pharmacist hesitated, then said, "I can write a letter explaining the medical necessity of the cooler. Sometimes, documentation like that helps." Ben left the pharmacy feeling slightly relieved. At least he was trying. Back home, the cooler sat quietly on the porch, like a fragile guardian of his survival. But the peace didn't last long. One evening, as Ben was returning from a short walk, he noticed something unusual. The cooler was gone. His heart stopped. He scanned the porch, the sidewalk, even the trash bins. There was no sign of it anywhere. Panicked, he called the HOA office. The voice on the other end confirmed the unthinkable. Karen had ordered the cooler removed, citing a violation of the community's aesthetic rules. They assured Ben it was disposed of properly. Ben's hands trembled as he listened. Disposed of, but that cooler had my medication inside. There was silence. Then the receptionist said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Rivers, but that's the policy. The board does not store or handle personal property." Ben felt his world tilt. Without that cooler, his medication was useless. It couldn't survive the heat or the elements outside his home. Desperation clawed at him. He tried to reach Karen directly, but she ignored his calls and messages. At the next HOA meeting, he stood before the board, his voice shaking but determined. "This medication keeps me alive," he said. "It's not just a cooler, it's my lifeline. How can you throw it away without my permission?" Karen looked him in the eye, her expression unreadable. "Rules are rules, Mr. Rivers. If we start making exceptions, it sets a dangerous precedent. The community must come first." Murmurs filled the room. Some faces showed sympathy, others discomfort. Ben felt isolated yet resolute. Leaving the meeting, he passed neighbors whispering and avoiding eye contact. He realized the battle was no longer just about a cooler or medication. It was about respect, dignity, and survival against an unyielding system. As Ben returned home that night, he knew the stakes had been raised. The cooler was gone, but his fight was just beginning. And somewhere behind closed doors, Karen prepared for the next move, convinced she was upholding order, that her actions had set a far more dangerous chain of events in motion. Ben Rivers stood outside the small community hall, the weight of exhaustion pressing on his shoulders. His mind raced as he prepared for the neighborhood meeting, the first real chance he'd have to face Karen. Walbridge directly and demand answers. The air was thick with tension, the kind that prickled the skin and whispered that this night would change everything. Inside, the room was packed with familiar faces, neighbors Ben had exchanged polite hellos with but had never truly known. Some sat with arms crossed, wary and cautious. Others watched quietly, curiosity flickering behind their eyes. The HOA board members sat in a row at the front, Karen in the center. Radiating the quiet authority she wielded like a shield. When it was his turn to speak, Ben stepped forward. His voice trembled but carried a fierce determination. "I want to ask no, to demand why my medication was thrown out." "How could you, Karen? You knew it was life-saving. How do you justify that?" Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, but her expression remained composed. "Mr. Rivers, I'm enforcing the Community's rules. No exceptions. Your cooler was a violation, and it was removed in accordance with HOA policies. But it wasn't just a cooler, Ben said, voice rising. It was my medication. You had no right. Karen's tone hardened. We do not make exceptions for personal belongings. This is about fairness. If one person gets special treatment, the whole system collapses. The room murmured. Some nodded along, while others looked uncomfortable. Ben's gaze swept the room. This isn't about fairness, it's about survival. Without that medication, I don't know if I'll make it. Karen shook her head. I'm sorry you feel that way, but rules are rules. I'm sure there are other ways to store your medication. At that moment, a sharp voice broke the silence. That's not true, said Mrs. Gonzalez, a neighbor, who rarely spoke. Ben's medication has very specific storage needs. You can't just shove it anywhere. Karen turned her glare toward Mrs. Gonzalez. This is not the place for medical debates. Ben swallowed hard. The room felt charged, lines drawn not just between neighbors but between justice and bureaucracy. After the meeting, Ben lingered in the hall, hoping to speak privately with Karen. He found her by the exit, clipboard in hand. Karen, he said quietly, this isn't just about rules. You don't understand what you're doing to me. Karen's face softened for a fraction of a second. I have my duties, Ben. You have yours. I'm not the enemy here. Ben shook his head. No, but you're the reason I'm scared to go home. Before Karen could reply, a loud knock echoed through the hall. It was the HOA lawyer, here to remind everyone that violations could lead to hefty fines and even legal action. Ben left the hall with a heavy heart, feeling more isolated than ever. At home, Ben checked his empty porch where the cooler had once sat. The absence was a silent threat. He reached for his phone and called his pharmacist. Please, I need your help, he said. They took my medication. I don't know what to do. The pharmacist's voice was firm but sympathetic. We'll figure this out, Ben. This is serious. The next days were a blur of calls, emails, and meetings. Karen's relentless enforcement only tightened the noose around Ben's life. Notices of fines arrived. Threats of legal action loomed. Ben's health began to falter. The stress worsened his condition, and without medication, his body rebelled. He felt the sharp sting of helplessness, the very thing he had hoped to leave behind. But amidst the pressure, something unexpected stirred in the community. A few neighbors began to speak up quietly, questioning Karen's rigidity. Whispered, conversations grew into open discussions. One evening, a small group gathered at Ben's porch, offering support and ideas. They wanted to help him fight back. Ben looked around, grateful but wary. The fight was no longer just his, it had become theirs, too. Across the street, behind drawn curtains, Karen watched the growing unrest. Her grip on control was slipping, and she wasn't ready to let go. The battle lines were clear. Ben's life was on the line, and Karen's quest for order had pushed them both to a breaking point. The days following the confrontation felt like walking through a storm for Ben Rivers. His health, already fragile, began to deteriorate under the crushing weight of uncertainty. Without his medication, his body betrayed him in small, terrifying ways. Dizzy spells, crushing fatigue, and a relentless ache that no amount of rest could soothe. Neighbors who once greeted him with polite nods now looked away, their eyes clouded with sympathy or fear. The silence in the community was deafening. Ben tried everything to find a solution. He pleaded with the HOA to reconsider, wrote letters explaining the gravity of his condition, and begged for understanding, but every attempt was met with the same cold response, no exceptions. Meanwhile, Karen Walbridge continued to tighten her grip on the neighborhood. Her official notices piled up in Ben's mailbox, warning him of fines and legal repercussions. For continued violation of HOA rules, she was relentless, a force of nature convinced she was protecting the community's integrity. But something was shifting beneath the surface. A few neighbors, moved by Ben's plight, began to question the HOA's ruthless stance. At the local coffee shop, murmurs turned to conversations. At weekend barbecues, whispers turned to arguments. One afternoon, Ben's closest neighbor, Mrs. Turner, stopped by with a concerned look. Ben, I don't know how you're doing it, but you need help. I talked to some folks, and they want to support you. Ben managed a tired smile. I appreciate that, but Karen's power. It feels like no one can touch it. Mrs. Turner shook her head. People are scared, but they're starting to see what's really going on. This isn't about rules anymore, It's about fairness, compassion. Ben felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't alone. At the pharmacy, his pharmacist was growing, increasingly concerned. After hearing Ben's story firsthand, he decided to act. "Ben," he said one morning, "I'm going to call the HOA myself. Throwing out prescription medication without the patient's consent isn't just wrong, it's illegal." Ben's eyes widened. "You'd do that?" The pharmacist nodded. "You shouldn't have to fight this battle alone." Meanwhile, Karen sensed the tides turning. Her phone buzzed with calls from disgruntled neighbors, some demanding answers, others threatening to take the matter public. The tight control she'd held for years was unraveling. Determined to maintain her authority, Karen sent out another round of letters, this time, doubling down. She warned the neighborhood that any support for Ben was misplaced, and that she would pursue full legal action if the rules continued to be broken. But Karen's warnings only fueled the fire. A small but growing coalition of neighbors organized a meeting to discuss Ben's situation and the HOA's harsh policies. They called it a Community Compassion Council, and Ben was invited to speak. On the night of the meeting, the room buzzed with nervous energy. People shared stories of feeling powerless, of being silenced by HOA bureaucracy. When Ben spoke about his medication, his struggle, and the cruelty of having it discarded, many were moved to tears. For the first time in months, Ben felt the warmth of genuine support, but that warmth was shadowed by a looming threat. Karen had learned about the meeting and was furious. She arrived unannounced, her presence a dark cloud over the gathering. "This is not how we operate," Karen declared, her voice cold and sharp. "The HOA rules exist to protect everyone. If you want to break them, be prepared to face the consequences." The room held its breath. The battle for Maplewood Estates was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. As Ben left that night, he felt a strange mixture of fear and determination. The medication might be gone, but the fight for his life, for the heart of the community, had just begun. The growing tension in Maplewood Estates had reached a boiling point. But beneath the surface, secrets simmered quietly, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Ben Rivers was still fighting for his life, but he wasn't the only one struggling. Behind the perfectly manicured lawns and the stern HOA letters, Karen Walbridge carried burdens no one knew about. One afternoon, as Ben met with Mrs. Turner and a few other neighbors to plan their next move, whispers started circulating. It began with small comments. "Did you know Karen's been acting strangely?" Or "I heard she's had some health problems." Ben was skeptical at first. Karen had always seemed so cold and unshakable. But the more he listened, the more a different picture began to form, one of a woman battling her own invisible fight. A few days later, Mrs. Turner approached Ben quietly. "I spoke to someone who knows Karen well. She's been hiding her own medical issues. Apparently, she's been on medication, the same kind that you take." Ben's eyes widened. "Are you serious? Why would she do something like this to me if she's struggling too?" Mrs. Turner shrugged. "Maybe it's denial, or fear. Sometimes people lash out when they feel vulnerable." This revelation unsettled Ben. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just the antagonist, she was a complex figure, trapped by her own fears and insecurities. At the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere shifted. Karen appeared more guarded, less commanding. When a neighbor cautiously brought up concerns about her recent behavior, she brushed it off with a tight smile. But Karen's facade was cracking. Behind closed doors, she wrestled with her own demons, the shame of her illness, the pressure to maintain control, and the fear that her secret might destroy everything she'd built. Meanwhile, Ben and his growing group of supporters pushed forward. They organized petitions, reached out to local media, and demanded that the HOA adopt compassionate policies for residents with medical needs. The neighborhood, once divided, was slowly coming together. People who had stayed silent began to speak up. The story of the man fighting for his medication resonated deeply, awakening empathy where there had been apathy. But Karen's resistance hardened. She doubled down on enforcement, sending letters threatening legal action against anyone who undermined community standards. One evening, as Ben returned home late, he noticed shadows moving near his porch. Heart pounding, he hurried inside, locking the door behind him. The threat felt more real than ever. The lines between ally and enemy blurred. Trust became a precious commodity, and Ben learned to be cautious. Yet even in the darkest moments, hope flickered. Karen's secret, once revealed, had the power to change the entire neighborhood, to transform hostility into understanding. The question was, Would Karen let it, or would her fear continue to drive her actions, pushing the community toward a breaking point? As the sun set over Maplewood Estates, the quiet streets held their breath, waiting for the next move in a battle that had become about much more than rules. It was about humanity. The phone rang sharply in the quiet pharmacy office, cutting through the usual midday hum. The pharmacist glanced at the caller ID and immediately recognized the number. It was time to act. Ben Rivers had spent weeks fighting alone against the HOA's relentless enforcement. But today, the battle was about to take a decisive turn. After hearing Ben's story firsthand, the discarded medication, the threats, the fines, the pharmacist couldn't stay silent any longer. Throwing away prescription medication, especially life-saving drugs, without the patient's knowledge was not just cruel, it was illegal. He picked up the phone and dialed the local police department, explaining the situation carefully. The officer, on the other end, listened with growing concern, promising to look into the matter. "This is serious," the pharmacist said firmly. "It's a violation of state and federal laws regarding prescription medication handling." Meanwhile, Ben waited anxiously, unaware of the pharmacist's bold move. When the call finally came, the officer's voice was calm but resolute. "We've received a report concerning illegal disposal of prescription medication. We'll need statements from you and anyone involved." Hope surged through Ben's veins. For the first time in weeks, he felt that justice might finally be within reach. But Karen Walbridge was not one to back down easily. When news of the police involvement spread through Maplewood Estates, her reaction was swift and fierce. She convened an emergency HOA meeting, her voice shaking with barely concealed anger. "This is an abuse of power," she declared. "Are simply enforcing community rules. No medication was deliberately discarded." Her words rang hollow to those who knew the truth. The mounting evidence painted a different picture. The police investigation gathered momentum. Statements from neighbors, the pharmacist, and even some board members who quietly supported Ben began to surface. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted from quiet tension to simmering conflict. Ben's supporters grew bolder, organizing rallies and demanding transparency from the HOA. Signs appeared on lawns: "Compassion over control," "Support Ben, support life." Yet Karen refused to admit any wrongdoing. Her stance hardened, her public statements laced with defiance. But beneath the bravado, cracks were forming. Late one night, Ben's phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source, one of Karen's closest confidants. "She's scared." The message read, "There's more going on than anyone knows. Watch closely." Ben didn't know what to make of it, but he felt a chill run down his spine. The conflict was about to get more complicated as the investigation deepened. Law enforcement officials uncovered documentation that supported Ben's claims. The discarded medication wasn't just a mistake, it was a violation with serious consequences. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as the possibility of legal action against Karen loomed large. For Ben, the battle was no longer just about his medication. It had become a fight for dignity, for fairness, and for the soul of Maplewood Estates. The pharmacist's call had sparked a chain reaction, one that might finally bring light to the dark corners of the HOA's rulebook. But the question lingered in everyone's minds: how far would Karen go to hold on to her power? The morning sunlight spilled over Maplewood Estates, like a calm before an unseen storm. But inside the neat white-trimmed homes and perfectly trimmed hedges, a storm had been raging for weeks, and today, it would reach its breaking point. Ben Rivers woke up feeling a cautious sense of hope. The pharmacist's call to the police had set the wheels in motion, and now, the authorities were finally taking his side. But as he prepared to face another day in a neighborhood torn apart by conflict, he didn't know just how far things would go. Word had spread quickly after the police began their investigation. Rumors and whispers filled the air, dividing neighbors between those who supported Ben's fight for fairness and those loyal to Karen's iron-fisted leadership. But the real shock came late one afternoon when a squad of police officers arrived at Karen Walbridge's doorstep. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains and front doors as the officers knocked firmly and presented a warrant. Karen answered the door, her face pale but defiant. She had known this day might come but hadn't allowed herself to fully believe. The officers explained she was being placed under arrest for charges related to the illegal disposal of prescription medication and harassment. A collective gasp swept through the onlookers. Some whispered prayers. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The woman who had ruled their community with strict rules and fear was now the subject of legal consequences. As Karen was escorted into the police car, she turned her gaze toward the street where Ben stood with a small crowd of neighbors. Their eyes met a silent exchange filled with years of conflict, pain, and unspoken truths. Ben's heart pounded. He knew justice was not revenge. He knew Karen's actions had caused him immense harm, but deep down, he also understood the struggle behind her facade. The arrest sent shockwaves through Maplewood Estates. The HOA board scrambled to regain control, sending out statements and trying to downplay the severity of the situation. But the community was forever changed. Neighbors, who had stayed silent now, spoke openly, sharing their own stories of intimidation and unfair treatment. The one silent majority found their voice. Ben's health began to improve slowly. Bolstered by the return of his medication and the support of the community, he became a symbol of resilience, a man who refused to be silenced or defeated. Yet, even as the neighborhood started healing, an unexpected revelation awaited everyone, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about. Karen Walbridge. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers filled the seats, all waiting for the final chapter in the saga that had gripped Maplewood Estates for months. Ben Rivers sat quietly, his hands folded, his heart steady but hopeful. Across the room, Karen Walbridge sat with a guarded expression. Her once imposing presence diminished under the weight of reality. The prosecutor laid out the case. Clearly, Karen had illegally disposed of Ben's prescription medication, violating state laws designed to protect patients. Witnesses described the harassment and relentless enforcement of rules that had driven Ben to the brink. The evidence was overwhelming. But just as the verdict seemed inevitable, a new unexpected detail emerged, one that no one had seen coming. Defense attorney called a witness, Dr. Emily Carter, Karen's longtime physician. She spoke quietly but firmly about Karen's hidden struggle. For years, Dr. Carter explained, Karen has been managing a chronic illness that requires the same medication Mr. Rivers relies on. This is something she's kept private out of fear and shame. The courtroom fell silent. Faces exchanged looks of surprise and sympathy. Karen herself took the stand, her voice trembling but honest. I threw out Ben's medication because I was angry and scared. I was fighting my own battles, and I lost sight of what was right. I thought if I could control the neighborhood, I could control my life. Ben listened, feeling a complex wave of emotions, anger, sadness, but also compassion. The rigid, unyielding woman he'd battled was also a person struggling in the dark. The judge considered all the evidence and circumstances. Karen was found guilty of illegal disposal of medication, but received a sentence that included community service and mandatory counseling, acknowledging her own health challenges. Outside the courtroom, a new atmosphere settled over Maplewood Estates. The HOA board announced immediate reforms, compassionate policies for residents with medical needs, transparent procedures, and open forums for concerns. Ben and Karen, once fierce adversaries, met one afternoon on a quiet street corner. There were no words of bitterness, only a shared understanding of the struggles each had faced. It doesn't erase the past, Ben said softly, but maybe it's a start. Karen nodded. I hope so. For all of us. The neighborhood slowly healed, with neighbors coming together not just as residents but as a community, flawed but hopeful, stronger because they had faced their worst and chosen to move forward. Ben's medication was restored, his health improved, but more importantly, a sense of justice and humanity had been reclaimed. And Maplewood Estates, once torn apart by rules and fear, found new life in compassion and unity.